Right. Good day, everyone. Welcome to this session, this important session on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the co-op sector. Before I begin, I'll just go through a few housekeeping items. The first is that I will switch to French to explain a few items as well. Bonjour, bienvenue à cette session sur la justice, l'équité, la diversité et l'inclusion dans le secteur coopératif. Je vous inviterai, si vous êtes francophone, à cliquez le petit icône de planète au bas de l'écran qui va vous permettre d'avoir accès à l'interprétation simultanée. Vous pouvez cliquer maintenant et on va vous servir. If you'd like to hear the speakers in English or the questions that are going to be asked in French, you can click the small planet icon at the bottom of your screen, which will allow you to hear the presentations and discussions in the language of your choice. So before we begin, I would like to make a land acknowledgement, and CMC is headquartered officially in Ottawa, the traditional and unceded land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. We're meeting virtually, but we did want to honor the land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dan Burnett, the Director of Strategic Alliances and Initiatives at Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, and I will be the moderator for this roundtable. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion are important pieces of the puzzle for a bright cooperative future. Therefore, we think that it's important to have discussions about this subject as we want to make a difference as individuals, as organizations, and as a community. We want everyone that is attending today to be able to share their experiences, their knowledge on the subject. To help set the tone, we've invited a few experts to share their different perspectives on JEDI and how we can be allies, all of us, to the cause on this diversity journey. We hope to be able to exchange concrete solutions to real problems so cooperatives and cooperators can be very proactive in terms of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So without further ado, and I will let the panelists, the presenters present themselves as they are in a better position to do so. The first of which is Dr. Caroline Hossein from the University of Toronto. Dr. Hossein?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'd like to thank merci Danielle et Véronique pour l'invitation et toute l'équipe. You really helped us to get organized and gave us some good sort of guidelines for today's session. It's an honor for me to be here participating in the Co-op Week. I hope I can lend some ideas, so share some of the work that I'm doing. A lot of it is research, but there's some actual policy implied work that I'm doing currently with a group of women who call themselves the Banker Ladies, have a Banker Ladies Council and a Rosca Federation. That's what they're striving to achieve. As Daniel said, my name is Caroline Shanaz Hossein. I'm a professor of global development at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. I also teach in the graduate program of political science in the downtown campus. A pleasure to be here.
And thank you, Dr. Hossein. As you have the mic, would you like to please sort of talk about your own experiences in the co-op sector and what you'd like to see the co-op sector doing?
Oh, okay. Yes, sure.
More inclusive.
Yeah, sure. I thought it was just introduction. So, sure. So I am a cooperator. I tell everyone that. I think a lot of the people, every time I do talks now, I think Daniel, you may be aware of that, that people often ask me, you know, who do you bank with? Who do you have your mortgage with? Who do you do your insurance with? And I try to guide people. It's not that I'm a marketing tool for various cooperative institutions, but I think there's lots of work to be done. That's why I wanted to be on this JEDI panel, because I think that through my research, I meet a lot of people who've been harmed by formal institutions generally, whether they're commercial or member-owned institutions. And I think that there is work to do in formal institutions, including member-owned institutions, credit unions, cooperatives, whatever, and that they're closer aligned to the kinds of institutions that often very excluded, marginalized people tend to form, which tend to be focused on group or collective ideas, and that I think that's what my research is focused on. It's focused on solidarity economies. So I'm thinking of cooperatives and how we expand the definition or the tent of inclusion. So that means structurally thinking about concepts like formality versus informal. And I think that instead of doing a lot of, I call them window dressing with EDI, and having a lot of tokenism, we're not really going to deal with structural issues. And I think one way cooperativism can address some of that is by acknowledging people in other places, Indigenous people right here, who have a wealth of knowledge on cooperativism. So I work in one of these informal mutual aid type of financing institutions. I'm focused on what we call for short ROSCAs, rotating savings and credit associations. These are a form of cooperative institutions in their own right. They're not a premature cooperative by any means. They're trying to be a standalone institution that has recognition. And I think that if we can start broadening what we mean by cooperativism, and that's currently what my work is looking at member-owned institutions, self-help groups, women's associations, ROSCAs, a number of different types of collective entities, quilombos in Brazil. I mean, there's just a plethora of types of cooperatives that don't normally abide by formality. And there's lots of reasons why people choose informal collective institutions. And I think that part of being an ally in this process of trying to think about how we become more accountable to a diverse group of people and their ideas is by widening that tent. And so that's part of the work that I'm trying to do, is to create some sort of recognition for the types of cooperators that are often ignored or not seen. And I'm happy to speak to that later, but I just definitely wanted to put that on the radar, because I think that if the cooperative sector needs to grow in the future and to think about amplifying how democratic institutions operate, then I think the future is actually with widening the definition of what a cooperator or a cooperative actually is, to start to see the variety of solidarity economies that are actually in alliance with what it means to be a cooperator. What does it mean to transform from a stakeholder firm model to one that is shared, community-driven, and focused on values and principles? I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. For the benefit of our attendees, after the various speakers have made their presentations, there will be an opportunity to either ask questions directly, or we invite you to share your own experiences and perspectives as a way to stimulate thought and conversation around this important topic. So this is really just to set the stage, and we will be looking to you after for that more active participation in this very large group discussion. Now, with that, I will turn it over to Susan Henry, who's with Alterna, as you can see by her background. But Susan, will you please introduce yourself and also give us some context on your points of view and experience, both personally and with Alterna?
Great, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here on this Co-op Week, and actually to be following right after Dr. Caroline Hossein. I do love her work. So my name is Susan Henry. I'm the Director of Community Impact and Financial Inclusion with Alterna Savings Credit Union. Okay. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Alterna, we are a full-service member-owned cooperative financial institution, and we share our expertise with over 200,000 members and a network of 47 branches across Ontario. In my work in Alterna, I lead our community impact department, and it has 4 main areas of focus. The first one is our community financial resiliency program, and that's around improving the capacity and reliance of our not-for-profit and charitable sector. Our community microfinance program, which works to address socioeconomic inequities by creating opportunities for financial independence and reducing barriers to banking for those often excluded from financing, with a focus on women, Black, Indigenous people of color, new and racialized Canadians, and low-income individuals. I also manage our community and financial inclusion grants, and these are grants for grassroots organizations that's often overlooked by large organizations, and our financial education programs, which focus on addressing social, financial, and economic exclusion of underserved, underrepresented individuals and organizations. And I thought I would reflect on who we serve at Alterna and why it matters. And to me, it really goes back to our cooperative values. And credit union were founded on these values, particularly equality and equity. And, you know, I find this year, this has been really important because I'm often asked, why do we have the programs we have? And when I'm asked that question, I really reflect more on those two values with an understanding that equality means an individual or group receive the same resources or opportunities, but equity recognizes that we're all coming from different circumstances that we have to overcome. And while equality and equity are both solutions of overcoming what we call imbalanced social systems, equity is what we need more of today. And that's really how we develop our community microfinance program. And the program was designed to address an imbalance in the marketplace, and it has been active for over 20 years. The primary objective of that program is to, like I said, address socioeconomic inequalities by creating opportunities and financial independence and breaking down barriers to banking. It also provides access to financial products and services, particularly for those who face many systemic barriers. And the program does this by offering a combination of loans, savings, financial education, and wraparound support to entrepreneurs and those who are looking to gain employment through professional development loans. We have over 76% of our participants in the program are racialized Canadians. When we look at the impact of these programs, the loans have helped individuals increase their income. And this can bring household stability, access to food, shelter, education, and asset building. And we want the overall impact to be poverty alleviation, improved quality of life, self-empowerment, and self-development, and to help promote our healthy communities. But there is a need for more. And, you know, we found at Alterna that we want to share our 2 decades of experience of the programs we offer, not through us only, but through our community loan fund partnership. And it really led us in 2020, our CEO heard about the federal program that was targeting Black entrepreneurs. And he reached out to the minister's office and was persistent in lobbying. And that sort of got us on the team to help develop the Black Entrepreneurship Loan Fund. And through that fund, we were able to create what we call the Black Entrepreneurship Loan Fund microfinance program so that there was more access to Black entrepreneurs. And we now work in partnership with FACE, and they're the Federation of African Canadian Economics, and the federal government. It was piloted in 2021, and we dispersed our first loans that year. I believe the Black Entrepreneurship Loan Fund is just the tip of the iceberg for providing access to financial supports for equity-seeking groups. We also have women, newcomers, Indigenous people, and other racialized Canadians that are underserved by traditional banking practices and institutions. And we've done a lot more work. It's actually led us last year to develop a new program with the Business Development Bank of Canada, with more focus on Black entrepreneurs, women, and social entrepreneurs, where they can have more financing. So our program goes up to $25,000, and BDC will now match an additional $25,000 for $50,000. And we found in our work that it was these 3 groups that were most excluded from financing through traditional sources. Three things that I think is important in advancing racial justice and equity. And, Dr. Caroline Hossein touched on this, but it's really amplifying our voices on policies and programs for underserved and racialized communities. Two, we know there's a huge element of inclusion in ensuring that these underserved groups have access to fiscal support, lead into the financial well-being and resiliency. So it is important to develop comprehensive and truly inclusive programs where members of the group have access to not just support, but a seat at the table where they're part of the decision making. And I think we need to think about that as rebuilding our systems from, rather than the inside out, but more from the outside in, which is really important. And that means involving those with lived experience, like community leaders and such. And last, I think, we need to develop a lot more flexible financial tools for access to other priority areas, such as housing, other lending and investment opportunities. So I sort of end it that it goes back to why equity is important, that there isn't a program where there's one size fit all. And I'll just, wait my turn for questions.
Thank you very much, Susan. And yes, I'm sure there will be many questions. With that, I'll turn it over to our next speaker. I will be, for the interpreters, I will be switching to French briefly. Donc, nous allons maintenant passer à Stéphanie Guico, ancienne vice-présidente du conseil d'administration de Coopérative et Mutuelle Canada et quelqu'un qui a une grande expertise dans le développement coopératif au sens large de l'innovation sociale. Donc, Stéphanie, à toi la parole.
Merci, Daniel. Et à l'intention des interprètes, c'était pas planifié comme ça, mais je planifiais parler en anglais. Fait que pesez sur vos pitons. Bonjour, hi, hola todos. I am surprised by how many folks are here from the States. Hi to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. As Daniel was mentioning, I was on the board of Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada from 2016 to 2021. I've been in the co-op sector now for the better part of 15 years. It was an early career decision that I have definitely stuck with. And over the course of time, have been more and more involved with startup co-ops. And so the position I found myself in with Co-ops and Mutuals Canada was by way of being nominated by CWCF and at the time Co-op Zone. And so I ended up inhabiting an intriguing space where my day-to-day is spent with folks who are at the hopes and dreams and implementation stage of things, and being sat at a table where the vast majority of the co-ops I was surrounded by were legacy maintenance mode co-ops. And that's not a knock, that's a beautiful place to be in. But it allowed for a culture switch and an integration into a culture that I am not specifically in on a day-to-day basis. And it's, I think, with those two perspectives that I'm speaking to you today. Also, I do want to mention, I had the honor and privilege of being the inaugural chair of the DEI committee for CMC. Now, up to you to tell me if it still exists. I left the board in 2021. With no look back. And so I can't say whether the work we put on the rails then has evolved or how it has evolved. And I can speak to that in questions or maybe a little bit in the 5 minutes allowed to me. But from that perspective, I committed to sharing of those two worlds. Speaking first to my experience on the CMC board, what was most striking to me as someone who had been developing co-ops, had also just come back from the States, again, a nod to my folks in the States from the worker co-op sector, had been working very much within the worker co-op sector. Arriving into a board culture where folks were mostly thinking about reinforcing the gains of the past and making sure we're not turning away from our founding principles, became to me a barrier for full inclusion. The time I spent on the board allowed me to start thinking of co-ops not only as a business structure upon which we've decided to project a bunch of principles and values. It more so made me realize just how much they're a self-reinforcing human system. Which is to say, when I realized just what it looks like 100 years down the line, when you have created a business that answers the needs of a specific founding group of members, and you're still looking to uphold those needs of that founding group of members, it becomes dangerous to not also be able to balance off with the fact that it's 100 years later, the world has changed, and the way the people look who now might be able to benefit from the needs you're meant to meet, the inability to adapt to that new demographic becomes an organizational risk. Realizing how much when people collectively control and own the systems they have stewardship over, how much it's possible for them to come into a defense position rather than an abundance position became really stark to me. And I had the privilege of being in one-on-one conversations with many of your DEI folks as I was figuring out just what it might look like for a federation, right? A third, fourth tier, in some cases, organization to appraise itself of a DEI role. Because we are, and I speak of we as though we're still within CMC, I'm projecting myself into my own past here. Because we were stewards of and representatives of a sector, we can't go faster than the sector. And that's something we decided very early when we were working on DEI. So getting a finger on the pulse of where the sector was at, I realized some organizations were very much in the arena of trying to figure out how to become less defensive, more in a position of abundance. We have something beautiful, let's share it. And others were still trying to wrap their heads around, but what does it mean for identity if the people around us stop looking like us? Does that put us in a place of compromise? Does that put us in a place of negotiations we're not ready to have? How much will it denature us from our legacy and force us to look to the future? Very, very interesting conversations to have. And I relay these obviously like anonymizing everything because they were all in confidence. They got really honest. The work at CMC also allowed me to realize that policy is one thing, implementation is another. I want to reassure you all who are listening here from a hopes and expectations on CMC posture. We realized that all our policies were just fine. None of our policies are barriers to including anyone. We're just waiting for y'all to be here. We were just waiting for y'all to be present, be brought in as delegates by your co-ops, be brought in and nominated for our board for that change to happen. And that's basically the point that we arrived at by the time I had left CMC. That place of like, all right, the field is set. We would be ready to welcome folks in. We just need for them to arrive. Now, in the original conversation I had with you all, and these are my parting thoughts with you all, the panelists, when we were figuring out like, who's gonna say what anyways, like what are our points of view on this? One thing you'd all encouraged me to point out was how are startups doing it differently? Now, of course, it requires the work of co-op developers to also do the work differently. And one thing that Maya and my peers have been doing a lot is to not reinforce founder syndrome, for one thing, and to write bylaws and create businesses that aren't hermetically sealed on the needs of the present, but are what we'd call in the sector future-proofed, where we build in the idea that, yes, hold ownership, but not too hard. Like realize that you're intending for the creation of something that is beautiful and useful into the future, and make sure that you're leaving space for the adaptation of the future. Try to never, ever only honor the folks of the past. Your history is your departure point, but look always to the future rather than to who we used to be and who we're still honoring. I'll part on that. Yeah, I think I made it right to 5 because I could talk about this forever and I look forward to your questions. But Daniel, back to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I will actually now turn it on to a different perspective in terms of Patrick Nangle and what the great work that's been Modo.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. And let me begin by saying how inspired I am by what I've heard from the 3 speakers we heard from already. Really, really wonderful to hear. I'm going to speak really from the implementation point of view. I lead a cooperative based in Vancouver called Modo Cooperative. I'll start by introducing. Most of you won't be familiar with that, so let me explain what it is and what we do. Modo is Canada's first and largest car-sharing cooperative, established in Vancouver 25 years ago. So yes, one of those legacy co-ops, I think we could say. We have 28,000 members today, more than 1,000 business counts. We have 800 vehicles spread across 25 municipalities in British Columbia. So the best way to think about that, effectively, thousands of people that co-own and share hundreds of vehicles through their co-op. So it's really sharing economy in the true sense of the word, not as has been co-opted by some others. We're growing at about 15% per year. So members and together with that, cars. We have a laser focus on our purpose. With realization of purpose is how we define success. It's the measure of success for us. And the purpose we define as to transform communities by connecting people with places in a way that's affordable, convenient, inclusive, and sustainable. So we've been working really hard to better understand how we're achieving our purpose in regards to these 4 attributes: affordability, convenience, inclusivity, and sustainability. And we've really found inclusivity to be the hardest one to kind of really put our finger on. Like all co-ops, we strive to adhere to the 7 co-op principles, including voluntary and open membership. But we asked ourselves, what does being inclusive really mean? And how do we know that we're inclusive? And what do we need to do to be more inclusive and know that we're actually doing it, that we're making a difference? So we've taken on 3 tracks of work. One is related to our 9-member board of directors, a second to our 60 employees, and then the 3rd track in relation to our membership, 28,000 and growing. So today I want to focus on the membership, the work around the membership, and understanding whether open and voluntary translates into diverse and inclusive. So I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds here, and I hope our intent at Modo is to share what we learn, what we do with other, especially small and medium-sized co-ops, the good, the bad, what doesn't work, invite feedback, and try to get better as we go along. So the first step we did to understand just how inclusive our membership is to do some research into how Black, Indigenous, and people of color are represented in the membership. So we wanted to determine the extent to which representation of BIPOC in the membership differs from the population in which we operate. So, and we wanted to look for, if there were differences, why, and how do we overcome those? So we engaged with some experts in the field to help us. So shout out to Majid Khoury and an organization called And Humanity, Vancouver-based. And we conducted the work in 2 phases. So first was a quantitative survey we sent to the current membership, and we got more than 3,000 completed responses and a lot of written commentary along with that. And then second, we did qualitative work. So the first was more around the numbers diversity, and the second was more around inclusion, qualitative. And for that, we talked to 30 non-members in the BIPOC community to understand, well, why wouldn't you join Modo? What would motivate you to do so? So what did we hear? So from the quantitative survey, so from the members, irrespective of ethnic background, the co-op was rated positively. And year over year, we see a high level of member satisfaction in our member survey, and it didn't vary by ethnicity. And the respondents also generally agreed that Modo is an organization that cares about diversity and inclusion. That was their perspective, if you like. We also learned, though, that our membership base does not proportionately represent the rich diversity that we enjoy in this part of the country. And very specifically, people of Chinese, South Asian, and Filipino ethnic backgrounds were underrepresented in our membership. Black and Indigenous people are proportionately represented by the numbers only. And then in the lower mainland, so think about the area around Vancouver, where BIPOC representation in the population is generally higher than places like Victoria or Kelowna, Chinese and South Asian member proportions were just half of what they are in the general public. So we learned a lot, and clearly a disconnect that we needed to better understand. So from the one-on-one interviews with non-members, we heard a few things. First, we were advised to make Modo more accessible to BIPOC communities by considering where we put the cars. You know, are they in the right places geographically? Something totally under our control, right? We're encouraged to more authentically represent BIPOC persons in our communications by telling more stories about actual members from each community, knowing that we had a lot of people in the membership that were having a very good experience with Modo, and the advocation to us was you should share that with the rest of the community. They also told us it was important, pretty obvious, I suppose, to be transparent about the current diversity of the team, including the leadership and the board. And finally, we were advised to provide unconscious bias and anti-racism training for all the staff. So as mentioned, for us, realization of purpose is really the ultimate measure of success. Are we achieving these things? Right? And inclusion is one of those core attributes. So what we're at right now, we have a set of key performance indicators, KPI indicators, not absolutes, that help us to understand if we're making progress. We've established a bonus to all employees. It's the only bonus any employee gets, is 100% tied to realization of purpose. And we talk about it a lot with employees. The financials are not unimportant, but it's really just a gate to pass through in order to confirm that we have the ability to pay any bonus. So what I wanted to share finally were 4 lessons learned at this stage. One, don't assume that because the membership in your co-op is open and voluntary, that you're thereby diverse and inclusive. It's not necessarily the case. 2, take the time to understand where you're at, both from a quantitative and qualitative perspective. 3, hold yourself accountable to making changes and confirm that it's actually happening, follow up. And 4, don't stop working on it. It needs constant care and attention. In our current 5 strategic themes as we define for this sort of 3-year cycle that we're in, diversity, equity, and inclusion is in that list. So it'll continue to get attention. So that's what I wanted to share at this stage. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Patrick, for those very practical experiences at Modo and the importance of both data-driven decision-making and storytelling as part of one's activities. I'd like now to turn it over to current CMC board member, Mary Nirlungayuk from Arctic Cooperatives and many other hats. So Mary, I'll let you introduce yourself and please tell us about your own experiences and visions for how the sector can be more allied and more supportive of DEI.
So it's interesting. Thank you very much for the invitation. Inclusiveness is what we talked about. I just spoke in my Inuktitut language. Inclusiveness, I believe, is not inclusive enough to meet the needs of the indigenous language that we talked about. And it's interesting in a way, a lot of ways that to speak in your official language of your choice, and it tends to be English and French. Well, that's the first step, I think, inclusiveness that we don't acknowledge enough. So that I wanted to mention that. On behalf of Arctic Cooperative and Arctic Co-op Development Fund, Arctic Cooperative is serving the 33 member cooperative across Canada, especially in the Arctic, one in Yukon, Nunavut, and Northwest Territories. And we have a membership that recently joined in April. Saskatoon and Saskatchewan. That was our current member. The other one is that from the servicing access to banking is where I'm going to focus a little bit more, and an Arctic Co-op development fund that supports it for accessing capital. In the Arctic Canada or in Indigenous communities in remoteness, access to banking services is very limited. Actually, we don't have banking services, so we partnered with First Nation Bank out of Saskatoon to meet the needs of banking services. What's very interesting, we talk about inclusiveness as well. And right here in Canada, we have those barriers and challenges that accessing basic needs across the North. What's very interesting in this particular topic that we can do a lot of meet and needs internationally from banking, and the issues continues to arise in the Indigenous communities. And the barriers that tends to come up is more around barriers than anything. We spend so much time in barriers versus resolving the issues. If we just put more attention to the solving the needs than the barriers, I think we could actually meet a lot of the needs. The other one is that the Arctic Cooperative has the Arctic Co-op Development Fund that supports the 33-member cooperative. It's a very vast remote of Canada, where they don't have transportation in some location like road access. Some of them have road access, but in the Nunavut territory, it's fly-in community. So Arctic Co-op Development Fund supports the member cooperative from inventory, for capital, for projects, and today that's it's about 50 plus years old now. That it supports these retail operations. And to one of the things that Arctic Cooperative is created by those member cooperative 50 years ago. Service Federation of Arctic Cooperative is owned by the 33 member locations. And however, they didn't want to be left behind in order to say that somebody else is going to come in and support us. So they created Arctic Cooperative, anywhere from financing to human resources, for merchandising, logistics, and Arctic Cooperative supports that in those particular needs. And what's very interesting in this creation of Arctic Cooperative is that if we don't have those services, Arctic Cooperative find a creative way to support them. And it's really meeting the needs of those services that is required. And we often talk about Indigenous term, but as an Inuk person, I don't call myself Indigenous, I call myself Inuk. And Dene people call themselves Dene people. And in those correct term of inclusiveness is really need to identify those particular needs as well. Because what happens is that using the term Indigenous, we get plunked into one area, and then sometimes it gets confusing and which Indigenous people are you referring to? And correct term is needed when we're speaking the language, I guess. However, in saying that, it's Arctic Cooperative is a very successful federation, and we work in the most harshest environment in Canada, and but however, we tend to not look at that. We tend to just work internationally and support international projects versus Indigenous or Inuit communities, and I think we need to shift those thinking as well as Canadians. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you to everybody. Before we jump in and turn over to the crowd and some of the questions that have come in, you will be able to raise your hand, and we'll take turns going through the questions. I'd like to invite you to keep it sort of a 2-minute comment or question, either to the panel or sharing of your experience, so that we can go through the second half of this roundtable and hear as much as possible from various perspectives. One thing I would just like to plug is the fact that CMC has been doing a lot of work to try to identify diversity within the sector. Some of it is linked to the investment readiness program that many of you might be familiar with. I'll ask my colleagues to put the link in the chat, but as part of that, we're also doing research that will come out hopefully in the next couple of months on specific co-ops operating in various ethnocultural communities or women co-ops and so on. Obviously, and there's no such thing as a Indigenous co-op per se from a legal point of view. However, when you're talking about Arctic co-ops or Fédération des coopératives du Nouveau-Québec, obviously there's some links there where the members are either primarily from, or the mandate of the co-op is primarily to serve X community. So I do invite you that if you are familiar with co-ops, go look at the map of cooperatives and mutuals in Canada, which my colleagues also put in the link. We want to make sure that we can tell the story better. So do flag, do self-identify, do refer co-ops or leaders that you know are involved in the co-op sector or should be, so we can keep our journey going forward and advancing. So with that, I do have a few questions, but the first one that came in, and I'll leave it to the panel, or whoever wants to go first in terms of answering it. But from your perspective or space in the co-op movement, are there specific success stories that you can share about the problem identification, current initiatives and commitments, and funding that mobilizes meaningful work in JEDI? So are you aware of initiatives and commitments that have been made by sector stakeholders or others that can help the sector in terms of JEDI? In addition to what Susan mentioned in terms of Alterna's great work.
I can go.
Go ahead, Mary.
I mentioned very quickly about Arctic Cooperative. I think Daniel also mentioned FCNQ in Northern Quebec. And it's a success story in the most remote communities in Canada. And I think they do a lot of these mini projects. And I think to recognize that from what they're able to do, it's a success on its own. They stand alone. They have very limited support from the government. However, Nutrition North Canada, to keep the costs down, that's a support from the federal government. Other than that, they're a standalone, and I think they're successful on their own. So I would say that. Just going to leave it at that for now.
Yes, Patrick.
Thanks, Daniel. I believe there's a lot of good work being done here and there in pockets. I'm quite familiar out here in Vancouver with Van City, so also credit union, kind of along the lines of what we heard from Susan at Alterna. Really good work done in community investment and supporting a lot of DEI-related initiatives, work both internally around employment, and creating and providing employment, and then with membership and reaching out to underserved groups. I think we could benefit from more sharing. I know the BC Co-op Association, under the work of Michelle Tsutsumi, also here in BC, is doing some good work to collate some of that, including rallying co-ops around the federal 50-30 challenge, if people are familiar with that. But I think there's room for more sort of amplification, so that we can all, especially smaller co-ops, can benefit from the good work being done by large ones. Thanks.
Thank you. And Stephanie, I don't know if it's a response or a question for your own, but feel free to go ahead.
A response of my own, and I speak to this from my point of view as a member of Desjardins. I have been personally impressed by how much Desjardins has put their épaule à la roue, elbow to the wheel, if that is at all an English term, and the change they've done in 8 years. In 2014, I worked for them at a time when they were trying to figure out whether the general membership would accept that there be a quota or a parity rule for women and youth on the board. That did not pass at the time. They had to water it down. I think this is public knowledge. Hopefully I'm not announcing this to anyone. Anyways, it's 8 years ago. Since then, this is publicly findable because, of course, recruitment happens to the general public of Quebec, you can note that each credit union now has a recruitment matrix that in some cases includes diversity, in some cases includes gender and age parity representative for the geography, sectoral representation, and so on. That so many co-ops or credit unions in this case have taken this on in such a short time, to me is impressive. And for folks who want to do a bit more research, just go sleuth like how they go and recruit at each Desjardins.
Yes, Caroline?
So I'm going to come in here a little bit more critically minded, because I think that largely co-ops, credit unions, nonprofits, all of these institutions that are speaking a lot about EDI are having very limited results. I mean, management, upper management is largely Caucasian, it's largely white, and it's largely male and privileged. And we're still having an issue. So we're looking for resources and subsidies to quote unquote diversify or culturally diversify. And so that, but the management structures still stay the same. And I'm not saying that, you know, there hasn't been any movement, but we expect subsidies and sort of praises for the small little token representation that's happening. And I think there has to be a fundamental shift in the ways in which we look. I acknowledge co-ops, first of all, with the monies that are being given to EDI projects are largely not even going to co-op sector generally, because even they are seen as threatening because we still focus on commercial types of firms or nonprofits that reinforce individualized forms of entrepreneurship and business, right? So co-ops are already sort of in the background as it were. So maybe more advocacy for like looking for resources so that things can actually change and shift structure. So we're talking about management, right? Like shifting from always a formal sort of corporatized mindset to one that actually starts seeing groups who do cooperation, but are often not seen because of the informality of the work they do and the labor they give. They're not even being acknowledged. So the ones that we tend to promote and advance are those that have the means to be part of a formal co-op sector. And so that's sort of my concern with a lot of the resources. We're still maintaining a very white male structure, whether it's cooperative or member-owned institutions or whether it's commercial, right? And so subsidies are doing very limited work at a very low end of most structures. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Caroline. I don't know if any of our other speakers would like to respond or add something. Okay. Building on that, and as a follow-up in regards to what was mentioned previously, there's a lot of talk, ICA, around the cooperative identity and the principles and so on right now. Many of you will have heard about the proposal to have an 8th principle on diversity. I am very curious as to your personal opinion on that, if it's needed, if it's required, if it can be folded or part of other existing principles. So would anybody like to start off this conversation?
I can start off on diversity for the 8th principle. As much as we're trying to acknowledge the inclusiveness around the principle on accepting equality, I don't think we focus enough around diversity of the cooperative system, because it's a very diverse, diversity in business and diversity in people. And I think the people portion of it is we don't always talk about it, how diverse it is. And I think that needs to be added so that it showcases that, as much as we're trying to be inclusive as cooperative, where we tend to work in silos. And I'm just saying that because I truly believe in the co-op system, don't get me wrong, I truly believe that. But however, we don't talk enough about the diversity in the people that are in those communities, and including Indigenous people. I think we overlook that so often, that it's as much as we're doing work, we need to have that, I think, in the principle. Thank you.
I fully agree with Mary. Mary, I just had to say that that's excellent, because there's this idea that knowledge and understanding of what member-owned institutions are comes from an external entity. And what people don't understand, that this is a legacy of knowing how, or as, you know, Betta Samoke, who wrote As We've Always Done, makes note that the Anishinaabeg people have always had a way of cooperating. It's just that it may not have been formalized, or it may not go by the same names that people in colonialized language speaking, here I am speaking English, use, right? And so I think even just understanding the diversity of thinking, of thought within, like, move away from shareholder model is actually a radical concept. Like, people think that that is, you know, and maybe we need to move from this extreme variant of capitalism, right? For us to start now undoing the violence that will always tier human beings, right? We always have to exploit a certain class of human beings. And that stems from a really violent capitalist system that we have. And I think Mary's on point with, you know, there are knowledges and difference within choosing a cooperative model. I know that Susan wanted to come in, so I'll stop.
Thanks, Caroline. First, I wanted to actually address in terms of management. You know, they are two of the two largest credit unions in Canada have women CEOs. So we are seeing some progression there. But when we think about diversity, you know, as a principle, you know, I do go back to my equality versus equity, because diversity, it wears many lenses. And, you know, what we do see in this sector is that, you know, they are individuals who, you know, who need that hand up, or needs to be, you know, there's not one size fit all for all. So, you know, when we see positions come available and we look at experience, there's a lot that I think we also have to consider in who is that underserved group or community that needs to be part of, you know, the larger equation. So diversity needs, you know, if we're going to add an eighth principle in diversity, it has to be a little bit more specific on what is the intention behind having that. Because at times it can do more harm than it does good. You know, when we, for example, when we talk about female representation, there is a big difference between white female representation and other racialized communities. And, you know, how do we sort of adjust to that when we are looking at principles?
Thank you very much. Patrick, Stephanie, any on to the next question? Perfect. Okay. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Well, let me throw my point of view into the ring, which is just, can we do away with the principles and just have a general do no harm perspective? Because I feel like principles alongside other things are convenient deflectors to just getting work done. Like, we spend, how much time at the ICA do we spend on wordsmithing? I think I'll leave it at that.
And I think I hear you, Stephanie, on that, but, you know, sometimes it doesn't get measured if it's not there, and it can get lost.
Thank you, Patrick. Yes.
Yeah, and I have to say the principle of co-ops, helping co-ops, supporting co-ops is one that I appreciate a lot. It resonates with us, and it would be a shame to let it go and speak too broadly, but I absolutely take your point. Maybe I will just make a comment on you know, whether, you know, DEI has a place in the list. I mentioned, you know, for us, it's, you know, this is amongst our 5 kind of, like, we call those strategic themes, for lack of better expression, just to keep focus on it at the highest level. And, you know, if it only served that purpose, to keep it in focus by getting it on this list, whether we like lists or not, you know, this does have a power across the co-op sector and has for a while could bear from evolution. Totally agree, but making sure that this is raised to the level of kind of collective or agreed importance, I think would be not unhelpful.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll now turn it over to the crowd, and Abe Gruswitz, please unmute yourself and ask your question and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm on Lenape Land in Newark, New Jersey here.
Can you show your camera?
I'm trying to figure out where I can. I don't see the camera thing here. I don't see this option for some reason right now.
The line with the camera should appear if you scroll your mouse to the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, I know it. I know where it should be, but it's not there for whatever reason. So I'll just ask the question. So in certain industry sectors, there are some issues that might come up in the more justice side of, diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice, particularly in the financial and insurance sectors. I was wondering if a speaker could speak on regular practices like using zip codes, which are naturally redlined for policies, and maybe even our relationship to law enforcement in their industries.
So would anybody like to comment on Abe's question in regards to zip codes, or in our case, postal codes, and redlining in regards to access to financing, and also from a justice point of view, relationships with the authorities?
Yeah, maybe.
Yes, Patrick?
So I'll come at it from maybe a bit of an angle, and not from a financial institution point of view, but maybe just to share an issue that we think about and haven't really resolved. Our cooperative is allowing people to share cars. People choose not to own a car. They use a shared car. They save a lot of money as a result. They reduce their environmental impact. They're assets of significant value that we're providing people to use. And so one of the things we look at is the people's driving history. And we know from a law enforcement point of view, there are certain parts of the population that are more likely to be pulled over by the police and maybe, issued an infraction than some others. That happens. And so we're trying to figure out, how do we take that into account when we're deciding, who can and can't, or allowing this to be an influence on who can and can't use the cars, the driving history, including driving infractions. Haven't landed there yet, but I think it's an example of how, these, I don't know if they're unintended consequences, but these issues kind of emerge.
Thank you, Patrick. Caroline?
Yeah, thank you, Abe, for raising that question on law enforcement, and also how we look at territory in terms of how we price products and what that means. Canada will tell you that we don't really, redlining isn't an issue up north. But from what I know, particularly within insurance, which has been very controversial here primarily in my province, but specifically in the Toronto area, has been that there has been a lot of territorial analysis, which basically means we use postal codes to try and understand where risk seems to happen most likely. And then we charge pretty high premiums for people who live in certain areas. So there is a problem we have with territorial analysis. I work with a lot of women who are part of informal cooperatives, who are constantly dealing with being charged excessively by virtue of where they're located, their home, their main residence, right? So that still seems to be an issue. And I think that there's some work that co-ops can do with trying to understand that injustice. The other issue you raised is with law enforcement. And again, that really affects the people that I'm working with We have a Banker Ladies Council that was inaugurated earlier this year, who is striving to create a ROSCA Federation, which is basically, if some of you came late, is an informal banking co-op or a mutual aid financing group, people of many groups, and they're trying to figure out how to create more of a federation to advocate. And the number one harm, Abe, that they are citing that is very severe has to do with interaction with law enforcement, police, confiscating their resources that they have collectively organized, and monies that often aren't seen as being legitimately collected because there's no recognition for the kinds of informal co-ops that they are participating in. So there is a harm, extreme danger, life threats happening to women cooperators who choose to operate in the informal co-op sector. So I think your question is really poignant. It's extremely important that formal co-ops try to understand how do we work with acknowledging the diversity of the types of co-ops that we have. And as Stephanie said, how do we make sure that there's not harm happening to certain co-ops who are not understood very well? So the issue of sort of territory bias, or whether you call it zip code, I call it postal code, that's infringing on cooperators, definitely, especially those who work in the informal. And then there is real life threats going on against cooperators who choose to operate their cooperatives in the informal. Thanks, Abe, for asking that question.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Mary, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Abe. Just from the living in the city, and there's a disparity that I noticed from the justice for non-Indigenous people as well. I think in Canada, it's noted in the last year or so about injustice for Indigenous people. The other thing is that it's very evident, they focus on, there's actually articles out there of incarcerated men that are Indigenous people. In Canada as well, missing, murdered, and Indigenous women and girls. That's very evident of the highlighted, and it's. I mean, I come from the Arctic. I often say I moved to the rest of Canada when I moved south, and so I think their disparity is very evident, and it's needed in a way that focusing on those particular support system is required, and there's just not enough resources. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I see we have a question from Sally Miller around the power dynamics. Sally, please feel free to unmute yourself, turn on your camera.
Okay, and I think you all can hear me now. Great. I'm really excited and inspired by the discussion about the collectives and the informal collectives, and sort of recognizing that there are other there are important forms of democratic economies out there. One of the things that I've come across in working with informal collectives is a question of how a collective avoids the power dynamics of one person dominating or one person doing all the work, which I think tends to happen particularly as the group gets larger than, say, 4 or 5 people. So it's a fantastic, important way of working, but I'd love to hear more about how they can work over a larger ecosystem, maybe.
Thank you. Do we have a speaker who would like to lead us off on this? Yes, Patrick?
So I'll speak to something that we're just launching right now, working with a professor at the University of Victoria who's doing some work around sort of democratic process and how to engage, if you like, the citizenry more in the process. And so in our case, we think about that in terms of the members. And so we're launching something that's sits somewhere between the leadership of the co-op, where I am, and the board of directors, which is elected by the membership to represent them and do governance. And so this is something in between, which the way the exercise works, the individuals that will be in this advisory council, as we're calling it, are chosen by lottery. So we put out a call for expression of interest. We had several hundred people that showed, indicated interest. And there's a tool that we use that's selecting individuals from that pool by lottery. And then the pool, we call it the cohort, will refresh every once in a while. And we have a chance with the tool, completely anonymized, but we have a chance with the tool also to introduce diversity on a bunch of different dimensions that reflect the population, like where we live, on a lot of different dimensions. So we ask kind of demographic sort of questions, identity questions from the people, the respondents, but it's completely anonymized outside of our view through this tool. So that's something that we're going to try as a way to be sure that what you described doesn't happen. I don't try to dominate as CEO of the business, or one of the board members tries to dominate, right? We really have the voice of the members because, at the end of the day, we're owned by the members for the members, and we don't want to lose sight of that. And it's intended that this professor will publish kind of as the good, the bad, and the ugly of the process, after we have a bit of experience with it. Thanks.
Yes, Caroline?
Yeah, well, I was wondering if Mary wanted to tackle that first, and then I'll come in after.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And if I'm off, let me know. From the Indigenous point of view, I noticed that something's being organized or something's being planned from anywhere from researching for it to include Indigenous people. But you have one individual as a spokesperson from Indigenous perspective. And it's kind of, my experience is it's kind of an afterthought. And I think what we need to change the mindset in a way that include them from the initial stage, from the planning stage, and have them in right from the beginning of the discussion. And I think that could make a big difference, because sometimes what I hear is that, oh, we have Indigenous people in this area, and then I would ask, do you have them around the decision making, on the board, on the executive? Do you have them where the Indigenous people, or they're in this area of the workforce? Well, that's not the decision making. You need to include them in the decision making in an executive right from the get-go. And so I think there's that work to be done as well. Thank you.
So I'm primarily going to answer the question, Sally, from informal institutions that I've been working with as a researcher. And I think over the last 11 years, I've met just hundreds of them who represent groups that can range anywhere from, usually typical number for a ROSCA can be anywhere from 8 to about 80, I say. But there's been exceptions where I've met them that, especially in Haiti, where they have hundreds, or, in Canada right here, I met a Jiangji that had 1,000 members spread across Canada. Yeah. So they vary in scope and size. And this idea of sort of the idea to push against cooperation and collectivity, often what you find is this is a rational choice sort of protest, is that they often say that, well, collectives and cooperatives, member-owned type institutions, the downside to their governance is that there will be this free rider syndrome or mentality, right? And that's why typically people sort of undermine and treat co-ops as though they're marginal institutions, not worthy of actually being quote unquote successful, because of this idea of a free rider notion that ultimately there will always be one or two people who dominate and control, because they're obviously subscribing to this sort of corporate mentality where you have CEOs and what have you on a very inequitable, unequal, unjust economic system. So they kind of analyze co-ops and the logic of collectivity not actually happening. So I think that while it's true, I think the terrain for informal institutions are extremely messy. I agree. But at least there is a space to hold for people often of the same socioeconomic class grouping to create an institution that they want. This is not to say that some institution will have a few members who tend to be more active than others. But over a period of time, what I've seen is that changes too. There are some members who can lift more, and there are other members who can't lift as much. Some of the most successful informal institutions I've noted have stronger governance structures, meaning that more members have designated roles, whatever that might look like. They may have someone who is a chair or president or a mama soul or a partner champion or whatever they want to call it. And then they'll have other people hold on like treasurer or executive or community, whatever they have. Those type of institutions then can speak to some longevity. But you're right, informal institutions can be very messy in terms of, you know, who's going to be managing it for the group. But once a group comes together, there's that understanding because the trust, it's built on a trustful system, right? People are seeing one member, one vote kind of mentality, and they're seeing that, okay, this time I can be in charge of this ROSCA or this group, and it can rotate that power dimension. I think I like the messiness and the uncertainty of informal institutions because that messiness is how democracy is actually made, as opposed to having this structural corporate model that claims they don't have a free rider because everyone's doing their job, but actually there's only very few people who extract a lot from those kinds of economic systems, right? So I think that when we think about informal institutions, know that some of the downsides or the risk internally is governance. And that's the kind of capacity building that informal institutions actually need. So I'm like advocating for they're advocating for a ROSCA Federation, the Banker Ladies of Canada. What they need are formal co-ops to help them invest in how do we do governance in a way that's across the board. I'll stop there.
Right.
If I could just add, Caroline, that a lot of that in the informal setting is based on trust, a trust that I don't think we in a Canadian setting fully understand, because it goes way back to generational trust. You know, when we think about that informal setting, I relate it more again to the trust factor and cultural factors of the groups.
And this notion of reciprocity, right? Like, so I may not be the quote unquote leader this time, but, you know, I may pick up my load when I have space in my life to do that because of these trust networks that Susan just mentioned. But there's also this idea of reciprocity, which I think is really inherently female and comes out of every culture, I think, on this planet, but this idea that we can actually give without expecting. And I think if the trade-off is that, I'd rather be part of those kinds of economic systems. I think if we have to worry about governance and how to perfect that, that changes depending on how that informal institution will be structured. And yeah, there may not be good for a little while, but at least we know that there is a relationship rooted in, as Susan says, this kind of trust. And it might be because it's socioeconomic. It might be that it's cultural. I have no idea, but there are different ways in which people will negotiate how we organize. And I think that's really exciting part of it. But you're right that there's lots of work, lots of homework to do on it. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you. One thing I'd like to ask the group, keeping specifically small and medium co-ops in mind, which make up 99.1% of non-financial cooperatives, what's one thing that a board member, one thing that a management level individual, and one thing that an employee can and should do, in your opinion, to advance their cooperatives DEI journey? So from board management and employee point of view. Brass tacks operational question, the one thing. And Stephanie, you had a smile, so I'm going to point to you to start first.
Just one. Dan, you know how I think it depends who the person is. Like maybe leave your house and speak to a person of color today. Like that could be it. Read a book. Take whatever first step into likely discomfort you need to take today to get you closer to whatever the goal is. And that goal can be that one first token person on your board, or it could be full anti-racism. Just take one step and take a next step the next day and just keep going.
Thank you very much. Patrick?
So it's hard to get to one, but so I'm going to focus on purpose and understanding what the purpose of the organization is, and overinvest. It's hard. People tend to do this a bit superficially. I come from the mindset purpose before strategy. Nothing else. You can't do anything else until you really decide why this organization, this collection of individuals exists. Co-ops in particular are founded primarily to serve a gap in products or services or some such thing. And think about that, and while doing the work, decide where inclusivity lands in the scheme of the purpose of your organization. I think all of the other stuff will follow, but I think this often is either neglected or underinvested in.
Thank you. Caroline?
Oh, no, sorry. I think I'm going to skip on that. I don't know if I have anything else to add to that.
All right. Susan, would you like to say a few words on the one thing that board management or individual cooperators should do to advance their cooperative on its diversity journey?
Well, I'm going to speak as a Black person. I am, right? And I'm going to say I've sit on many boards, and there's such an awkward feeling when you're the only one on that board that looks like you. So, I think that is something that needs to be addressed. How do we get more? Like, I vow not to sit on another board unless there's two of me that look alike, because it is a challenge.
A good point. Yes, Caroline?
Susan, I don't sit on those boards anymore. I refuse to use my labor that way because it's very stressful, but kudos to you to be doing that because someone has to. I also want people to know also too that it's not a matter of just even getting the culturally right person there, because I'm first and foremost a feminist. And I want to make sure that we get people who are, and I'm a leftist, and I want to make sure that I have people who have the right politics at play. So I don't want a conservative, capitalist, Black guy who has misogyny all over him. So I think it's also too thinking about the kinds of people that really want to push forward a progressive agenda. So it's not stocking it with people who maintain a status quo. And I find that extremely stressful to me, because I think a lot of universities, a lot of well-established nonprofits who are vested in keeping whiteness alive will have their tokens there to kind of parrot their same old institutional bias. So I think it's about finding those disruptors who are feminist in their orientation, who are thinking about things like equity, but really trying to drive through a process of belonging, right? Like, how do we belong and respect a variety of people, and not just because of racial background, but also because of class, sexuality, ableism. I mean, there's all kinds of interlocking oppressions that are occurring, and you need to find the people who hold that. Otherwise, what you'll have are a lot of stooges who keep representing the project for whiteness under the guise of being racialized, right? I'm going to stop there because I know this is being recorded.
And with that, I'll turn it over to Mary, please.
I like that. It's being recorded. So if I get approached from organization to speak on behalf of an Indigenous, I have to ask the question, as long as if I'm not a token, like that's just offensive if you're looking from a point of view of representation, and we check the box, and that's what I try to avoid as much as I can. However, in saying that, I want to be part of the solutions, and because I'm representing the Indigenous population or Indo population, because it's underrepresented in all levels, and so I just want to make sure we're included. So that's from my perspective. And one of the other things of reconciliation as an organization, those ones have to get to our workforce, have a presenter, have a spokesperson about reconciliation. And I think those steps, it doesn't have to come from the executive, it doesn't have to come the CEO, it doesn't have to be the decision maker. Embrace the employees that are in the workforce to allow those kind of things to happen in the organization. And I think we need to look at it from their point of view as well, because we tend to see it from this level instead of the employees level. So I think those are the steps that we can also take. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, and everybody who answered that. So as we approach towards the 1:30 mark, I want to put a last question out there. Obviously, this is, as mentioned, it can be hard work. It's long-term work. It's an ever ongoing journey. And as to quote Stephanie, it can and should and will be uncomfortable, and that's how change will happen. So if there is a closing remark you would like to make in terms of, a takeaway, a word of wisdom, special insight, something that inspired you in your diversity work, what would it be? So I will leave it open to whoever flags their interest in answering that first. The closing remark of this JEDI panel. All right, Patrick, lead us on.
Sorry, I didn't see anybody else. I would defer to anybody else. I think, I chose today very specifically to speak to the work we do around diversity of the membership. And I want to circle back to the discussion we just had about participation on boards. So in some boards, one gets invited and one gets to decide if you want to join or not. It doesn't usually work like that in the co-op world. There are elections, right? You choose to put up your hand as a member, and there's an election of the membership, and the membership elects its board. And I am strongly of the opinion that the surest path to diversity in the board is diversity in the membership. And it's one of the reasons that we focus on this work in our co-op. Diverse membership will, I think, be, it's not a guarantee, but I think it's a pretty sure path that people voting will more likely elect a representative board than not. So that's my last 2 cents. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Susan?
Yeah, I think for me, it's around the impact that we can create. When we do look at JEDI, what does the impact mean? And I know the programs that we are working on, and I work on with Alterna, is around having meaningful change to individual lives. And, in the last 2 years, particularly around the George Floyd movement, we saw the necessity of why that was important. And, the leadership within our organization at Alterna, the stands they took to ensure that, we were having more impact in the type of work that we're doing. So I'm hopeful today that I think, we will continue to see change. I echo what Patrick just said. I just saw, an organization went through their board nomination process, and, was really interesting to see others step down so others can have a seat at that table. So I think, you know, change is good, change is coming, and it will mean great impact for not just our co-ops, but our country on a whole.
Thank you very much for that insight, Susan. Mary?
Yeah, I think steps that we're taking are the right steps. Under about 7 years ago, 10 years ago, this is short ago, that we were only talking about gender balance and around the board meetings. That's only 10 years ago. And we took the steps, and I think some of the organization are taking those steps. We get caught about our membership. Well, then why not appoint somebody that is from the membership that's gender balance? And so, and that's the governing body that could make those decisions. And I think those ones, we have to look at it, continue to push the membership to have balance. Now we're talking about diversity. That's another step that we're have to look at around the board table, and hopefully we'll get there someday. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Caroline?
So amazing. All these ideas are just brilliant to me. I'm just trying to jot them all down. Again, I want to say thank you for everyone that showed up and made time today, and to CMC for organizing this. It was really a pleasure, and I've grown from it. If I had to say a few takeaways that I think, first of all, I should say that the practitioners who do cooperative development, kudos to you to have this conversation, because researchers working on cooperatives suck at doing this work. They are they're extremely conservative. They have lots of blinders, and they're not apologetic for the kind of research that they're doing. And so I think that as practitioners, as cooperators in the field, when you hire consultants or you're doing readings or you're inviting speakers, look for experts in Canada who are pushing solidarity, cooperative types of research and work in our cultural context. We always tend to go to the US as sort of like, they can help us with this. But actually we have experts here in our own country that can be assisting in how we look at cooperative development. And hopefully it'll be one that's an anti-racist feminist agenda, thinking about solidarity or community economies. And I think that the last, note that's important is, how do we start to have a discussion on informality and widening the tent of cooperation? Because once we start doing that, what a cooperator looks like, maybe that's the campaign, what a cooperator looks like. We will start to see changes happening, because then you'll start to see that knowledge doesn't reside in the pale white male anymore. It's actually lots of immigrants who are bringing over their own forms of expertise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And we'll have the closing statement from you, Stephanie.
Are you sure? Do you know what you just asked? No, I'll keep it light. Thank you, everyone. I came into this a little grumpy. I am leaving a little hopeful, largely because I realized just how much the road ahead to whatever today's version of perfection is, and knowing that we're being called on by younger folks, and I am no longer the youngest person in the room anymore, which is such a nice place to be in. Like speaking to 20 and 40 and 30-year-olds who are already expecting more than what we are still trying to do today, puts me in a place where I feel like I'm constantly going to have to never be comfortable and always adapt and always think of the next thing that has to change and the next thing that has to change. And so I'd call on all of us to, as we're bringing things to the next level of change, which might be yesterday's, don't seal up the system too fast. Keep it able to adapt. Keep it able to be future-proof. Stay in that kind of ego death place where nothing that you're a part of is an identity marker for you. I think that's the main thing for management and boards and presidents when I'm working with them. Don't be too identity attached to what you just accomplished, because you'll want it to stay the same because it represents you. Keep a healthy level of detachment and just go out there and get as uncomfortable as possible.
Thank you very much. We are at time, everyone. I'm sure we could have this conversation for many more hours, and I invite you to keep having those conversations together, to reach out to other folks that are on this call, to the panelists and so on. I invite you to share your stories. I invite you to fill out the questionnaires around governance and so on, so we can have better data. Those academics love their questionnaires, and we're happy to have the data once it's resolved. And I invite you to get engaged. So on behalf of Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, thank you very much for participating today. Thank you very much to our panelists, and love this conversation and where the sector is heading. Thank you very much.